Cognitive biases are predictable flaws in our thinking that affect how we process information, perceive others, and make decisions. These mental quirks often lead us to make errors in judgment, hold on to false beliefs, and even perceive the world in ways that just don't match up with reality. Unless you are a literal robot, these biases affect you too. Understanding what they are and how they affect us is a good step towards correcting for them, making better decisions, and also just not driving people crazy with our completely irrational behavior. In this video, I'm going to share 5 cognitive biases that are really common but seldom discussed. I'll give you some examples of how they mess us up, but also how we can correct for them. And if you stick around till the very end, I'll give you a bonus bias that you can use to thwart your enemies. Let's jump in. The backfire effect. This occurs when your beliefs actually get stronger when you're presented with contradictory evidence. In one study, researchers looked at whether or not people were intending to get a flu vaccine. It turns out that presenting those who already thought the vaccine was unsafe with information disproving their beliefs, providing them information about the myths surrounding vaccinations, actually made them less likely to get the shot. So if somebody does have a misinformed opinion and giving them facts only makes them dig their heels in further, what do? Well, it turns out that how you actually present the information makes a really big difference. Another study looked at people's beliefs surrounding federal welfare programs. Now, it turns out that most people were really misinformed about how much they cost, what they do, and what they achieved. And people who were least informed were most confident in their opinions. When they presented people with facts about these welfare programs, it did little to change their opinions about them. With another group, researchers tried a different approach. First, participants were asked how much did they think was being spent on federal welfare programs. They were then asked how much they thought should be spent on those same programs. After being asked the questions, they were then given the facts. In most cases, not only was the amount being spent on welfare programs by the government less than they thought was being spent, it was also less than they thought should be being spent. Now, in this condition, researchers were much more successful at changing people's beliefs. Because rather than being put in a position where participants felt their deeply held beliefs were being challenged, they were presented with information that allowed them to come to their own realization that they were wrong. Now, it's a really subtle difference, but if you want to avoid the backfire effect, you need to provide people with information in such a way that they can internalize it and reach their own conclusions. And you can guarantee that if you go about the place telling people you're wrong, or misguided, you're misguided, you're not going to have much success in getting them to change their views. The curse of knowledge. This is a cognitive bias where we assume that people know as much as we do about a given subject, and as a result, we find it really difficult to communicate with people that don't have the same level of expertise. The best example of this bias is from an experiment by Elizabeth Newton. She played a simple game where people were allocated 2 roles, a tapper and a listener. The tappers were asked to think about a really popular song, like Happy Birthday, and then to tap along on the table to that tune. The job of the listener was to try and figure out what song was being tapped. Over the course of the experiment, 120 songs were tapped, and only 3 were guessed correctly. But here's the interesting thing. Before the guessing began, Newton asked the tappers how many songs they thought the listeners would get right. And they predicted 50%. In reality, the tappers got their message across 1 in 40 times, but they thought they would get it across 1 in 2. So the question is why? So when the tapper taps along, it's just impossible for her not to hear the song in her head. Meanwhile, all the listener hears is some kind of bizarre Morse code. The problem here is once we know something, like the melody of a song, it's impossible for us to unknow it. We have real difficulty sharing with others because we find it impossible to recreate their state of mind. Now, this bias causes all kinds of problems in lots of different professions. Teaching is the obvious one because we find it difficult to remember all the steps along the way and connections we made to make sense of a topic. And as a result, we can just leave our students or people we're trying to help completely baffled. It's also an issue in sales. A salesperson or marketeer could have all kinds of expert knowledge about a product that is just too overwhelming and not relevant to the person we're trying to sell to. And in these kinds of circumstances, we can just completely miss the point and even skip out the most important information that would actually make them want to buy the thing in the first place. There are tons of things you can do to correct for this bias, and one obvious one is just to ask people for feedback. Am I making sense? And if they look confused, well, you got some work to do. The false consensus effect. Now, this is an effect that explains the phenomenon where people believe their opinions and actions are far more common than they are in reality. And when other people behave in a different way, then they assume that those people are strange, unusual, maybe even deviant, and their behaviors are just indicative of perhaps poor character traits. For instance, one person enjoys feeding rats in an alley. They vote Democrat and they eat applesauce for breakfast. They might think these behaviors are completely normal. But if somebody else comes along and they avoid those rats in the alley, like the plague, there's a joke there somewhere, they vote Republican and they've never eaten applesauce in their life, let alone for breakfast, person number one might think they're quite strange. The interesting thing is that even if someone knows their choices are strange, like a monk or a clown in the circus, the reality is they will think their decisions are much more normal than others might assume and have nothing to do with their individual character and personality. Clowns can have rational beliefs too. Now, there are several theories about where this bias comes from. It could be to do with the fact that we tend to surround ourselves with people with similar backgrounds, experiences, interests, and values. And as a result, we don't have many examples of opinions and behaviors that differ wildly from our own. In the psychology literature, this is called selective exposure. There's a particularly interesting link between the false consensus effect and social media use, which provides some evidence at least for this second theory. In one study, researchers assessed false consensus effects for how others assessed the personalities and motivations of people around them. And they found that higher social media use was associated with greater levels of false consensus effect. The theory here is that people tend to fill their social media with others that share similar views and opinions to them, and it creates a sort of echo chamber where we just hear the same views and opinions over and over again. If you want to burst out of your bubble and try and avoid this bias, a good place to start is by turning off social media. Seek out a really diverse range of views and try and get a more balanced view of current affairs in the media. And if you're interested in that topic specifically, I've made a video on it and you can check that out up here. Confirmation bias. This is our tendency to seek out information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. Processing all the available facts and data is actually quite a time-consuming task for our brains. So a quick shortcut for us is just to pick out the information that already confirms what we believe. Now, of course, this leads to faster decision-making, but in the long run, we can trip ourselves up. In practice, confirmation bias works in three specific ways. Bias search, so this is when we search for information in such a way that what returns to us already confirms what we believe. So a common example is to say, if you Google, are dogs better than cats? You'll get loads of information back telling you why dogs are better than cats. But if you believe that cats are better than dogs, you might search into Google, are cats better than dogs? And now you'll get a whole bunch of links that explain to you why cats are better than dogs. So even the way you frame what you ask can result in you just getting information that confirms what you believe already, rather than helping you get to the bottom of the matter. Bias memory, so this is where you get new information, but you actually only remember the stuff from that information that confirms what you already believe. But the most interesting of these three is bias interpretation. So in particular, when we look at people's strong beliefs about complex social issues, confirmation bias shows up really strongly. In one study, 48 participants who either opposed or supported capital punishment were given some research papers to read. In fact, they were given two studies that were completely made up, but one of them demonstrated that capital punishment was really effective, the other that capital punishment was not effective. And at the end of the experiment, participants were asked how convincing they thought the studies were. Those who opposed capital punishment said that the studies that demonstrated that it actually was not effective were really convincing. Whereas those who supported capital punishment said the opposite. They thought those studies were not convincing at all. So it seems as though if we're presented with evidence that seemingly contradicts what we already believe, then we might just interpret it as not very useful or not very reliable. This is quite confusing. Now, if you want to overcome this bias, and in reality you just might not, the best way to do it is to seek out information that disproves what you already believe. Look for areas where you might be wrong instead of looking for areas where you might be right. And if you know somebody who holds an opposing view, then ask them to help you see what they see. Be open to their ideas and explore them. And lastly, we've got the Pygmalion effect. This effect describes how our positive expectations of people can actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe that somebody is going to perform really highly, then it turns out that influences the likelihood of that coming true. The Pygmalion effect got its name from the Greek myth of Pygmalion, who was a sculptor who carved a statue of a beautiful woman and later fell in love with it. He wished that he could find a woman as beautiful as this statue to marry, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, granted his wish and turned the statue into a living, breathing woman. So just as Pygmalion's fixation on the statue allowed it to come to life, our expectations can impact the outcome in a given situation. Now, the effect has been demonstrated in lots of different settings, but it was first observed in the classroom. So if you imagine you're a teacher and you believe that one of the kids is really smart, intelligent, and has got great potential, of course you start giving that kid a bit more attention. The kid notices and responds. They want to live up to your expectations. And it turns out it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They do actually perform at a higher level than their peers. But this can actually work the other way around, and this is referred to as the Golem effect. And this is the bonus that I wanted to give you at the very beginning. The Golem effect is the opposite, so you have low expectations of the person, and as a result, those expectations become true. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy where negative beliefs about someone hinder their actual performance. So let's imagine you're a high school teacher and a new student joins your class. Their two siblings have recently graduated and they were forever causing trouble and making your life a misery. Chances are, if this new student misbehaves only occasionally, you reprimand her much more strongly and regularly than the other students in the class. And as a consequence, she feels like you're being unfair, she disengages and flunks. Not ideal. So there are loads of lessons here for people in leadership positions. If you set high expectations of people, that will increase the likelihood that they will fulfill their potential. And if you've got enemies, then set them low expectations. And this will probably thwart their path towards world domination, maybe. So cognitive bias is a really fascinating subject, and I've only covered the tip of the iceberg. If there's a specific bias you'd like me to talk about in future, then let me know in the comments below, and I might make a video about it. And if you're interested in the topic of critical thinking more generally, I recently made a video on logical fallacies, which is a kind of linked topic, and you can check that out by clicking on the card up here. Hope you get a kick out of it. Peace.